All right, John 21, that's where we're going to be. You know, there's a verse that in Romans chapter 8, that is a verse that all of us probably are super grateful for. Paul is finishing up chapter 8, and in verse 37, he says this: "No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." And it is such a foundational statement that Paul talks about here, about the love that God has for the world. So much so that in John, the most famous verse in John says what? For God what? So loved the world that he gave his greatest treasure. He gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him will never perish but have everlasting life. Like, this love is so foundational, so much so that the Bible even says in 1 John that God is what? God is love. He's not partly love. It's not like he's one part this and one part this. The very nature and essence of the very being of God is love, which means he must operate out of his own nature. So anytime there is a moment in our lives, the love of God is there. He is there to do nothing but create the conditions for things to flourish. And so when you get to a tough spot, I don't know if you guys have ever been in a tough spot. I've been in a couple of them. You are desperate for the love of God. You're desperate sometimes for the restoration of God. I don't know if you guys have ever been in a place that you just desperately needed restoration. Maybe with somebody that you were with, a partner, a friend, a former employer, maybe just in your church. Maybe something happened in your life and you just desperately needed restoration. You need to be brought back into fellowship again with them. When you experience restoration, there's not many things like it. Because if it's real, it's stronger than ever. Because there's a real authenticity and there's something beautiful about it. It's because it reflects the love of God. That's why. So we now get to chapter 21. This is the final chapter of the Gospel of John. It's hard to believe we're finishing the Gospel of John. And it's a little bit like most people call chapter 21 the epilogue. The gospel really ends at the very end of chapter 20. This is the kind of the final words at the end. We see the restoration of Peter. It's interesting, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the betrayal of Jesus, but none of them record the restoration of, the betrayal of Peter, but they never record the restoration of Peter. John doesn't focus on Peter's denial as much as it records his restoration. I mean, it mentions it, but it focuses on his restoration. So John is this apostle of love. He is the one that loves the Lord. He is the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so anytime he gets a chance to show the love of God, he's going to do that. So we're going to get to that here in just a moment. But I want to show you here, beginning in verse 1, let's kind of ramp up to it. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. This is the third time. He revealed himself in this way: Simon Peter, Thomas called twin, Nathanael from Cana of Galilee, Zebedee's sons. The two others of his disciples were together. "I'm going fishing," Peter says to them. "We're coming with you," they told him. They went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Now, it's very easy just to read past these verses, but I want you to notice something. What is significant about what just happened?
Peter's returning to his normal route.
Okay, Peter at this point is wondering, what's out there for me? I may as well go back and be a fisherman again. Maybe that's what he's thinking. This is all I know. I may as well go back to what I used to do. That could be it. I think that's the significant part, Grady. Grady said he's got his friends supporting him. You know, all four Gospels record the betrayal of Peter. Peter told everybody. And yet, what do his friends do, Chris? He tells them, I denied our Lord publicly in shame as he's being taken away. And how do his friends treat him after that confession of betrayal? They don't depart. They stick right there with him. They don't look at him and say, how could you? I never would have done such a thing. They look at Peter, and probably with enormous love that their Lord taught them for 3 years, serving Peter, loving Peter. Peter might have even thought, I'm just going to go by myself. I got to get away. He probably still couldn't live with himself because the image of what he did is probably replaying in his head over and over again. You guys ever had the image play in your head over and over again? You ever had, don't say what the image is, we're on camera. And he probably has this image in his head of being by the fire, denying the Lord, cursing in one moment, saying, I don't know the man. Remembering the same time, he was the one who said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. I don't know the man. And he denies him. And I'm sure Peter could not get that out of his mind because the text says that when the rooster crowed, and Peter looks at him. Remember what it says? What did Peter do? It says he wept bitterly. Wept bitterly. This was deep pain for Peter. Deep pain. So there might have been a real sense that Peter's like, I'm just going to go fishing. I just got to get away. And his buddies say, hey, we're going with you. We're going to hang out with you right here. You ever done that where you kind of just wanted to get away and you just had some buddies say, hey, let's hang out. Let's spend some time together. And that's the role of a friend, right? That's the beauty of a friend. It's not a conditional friendship. It's a friendship that says, where are you? What do you need? How are you doing? So here you go, they say, we're coming with you. They went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. When daybreak came, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not know it was Jesus. Friends, Jesus called them. You don't have any fish, do you? This probably reminds you, if you can remember, Luke 5. It's the exact same scene. They're out fishing, not catching anything. And Jesus sees them and says, hey, throw your nets over to the other side of the boat. They say no. Verse 6, cast the net on the right side of the boat, he told them. You'll find some. So they did. It's interesting. One, they couldn't recognize who it was. So who are they listening to? I read one commentator made a good point. They said that from the shore, they're about 100 yards away. And sometimes from the shore, you can see schools of fish kind of where they are sometimes in the ocean. So they might have just been listening to this person because he might be able to see something. Hey, throw your nets on the other side. That's where the fish are. Maybe. We don't know. But they cast their nets on the right side. Verse 6. So they did, and they were unable to haul it in because of the large number of fish. The disciple, the one Jesus loved, said to Peter, it's the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he tied his outer clothing around him, for he had taken it off, and plunged into the sea. Since they were not far from land, about 100 yards away, the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. 100 yards may not seem a long way, but if you've ever tried to swim, 100 yards is a long way. I'll go sometimes, not very often, I'll go swim with Stacy. And I'll say, how far are you going to swim today? Oh, probably just 500 meters. 500 meters? I can barely make it down and back on the pool without, sucking in water. Peter's out swimming. He's probably swimming as hard as he can to get to the shore. It's a 100-yard swim. He gets there. Meanwhile, everybody else is bringing in these fish. And he says, verse 9, when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish lying on it and bread. What's that image of? When's the last time you see a charcoal fire? When Peter was sitting by the fire and he denies the Lord. Bring some of the fish you've just caught, Jesus told them. So Simon climbed up and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. Now, I want you to imagine this. 153 fish. It's estimated that each of these fish weighed a minimum of a pound, and some maybe up to 2 pounds. So that means Peter by himself is dragging a net that weighs what?
200-300 pounds.
Yeah, at minimum 150 pounds. Could be 225, maybe 3, who knows? And Peter by himself drags this net to the shore. How strong do you think Peter must have been? Dragging a 150-pound, 200-pound net, drags it to the shore. Even though there were so many, the net was not torn. Come and have breakfast. So we had the Last Supper, now we've got the first breakfast. This is about to be, did you like that? Yeah. Yeah, Kevin?
Significance of 153.
Well, that's a great question. I was hoping we wouldn't have to talk about it. But, throughout history, there have been a number of people throughout history that have tried to do some spiritual analogy to the number. Some said that Israel represented, the 100 represents Israel, 50 represents the Gentiles, and 3 represents the Trinity. I think that was Origen. People go back and do these numbers and try to come up with some spiritual meaning. I think basically they caught so many fish that they're like, how many fish did we catch? This is an incredible catch, right? What do you do whenever you catch a bunch of fish? You count them. You catch a few fish, you don't like, oh, wow, we got 7 fish. No, you get a net, it's so full, it's the biggest catch you ever had. You want to know, how many fish did we just catch? I think that's all it is. I think they were curious and just said, let's count these things, because this is it's the beginning of the first fishing story.
Well,
Yeah.
I think also, sometimes when you give specifics like this, it plays into the validity of the statement, rather than saying, caught a bunch of fish. Like, did that really happen? Yeah, there was 153 fish in there. Go ask John.
Yeah.
The more specific in the story, the specific nature of the story lends to its validity as opposed to just being a generic number. A generic weight or generic whatever lends to it being more of a parable or a tale. But when you add specifics, it makes you think, okay, there's a lot, that detail must have meant something. They all must know that detail.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
I think that's great. I think that's very true. We talked about how with John, these little details show the historicalness and the humanity of the text. Little details. John outran Peter to the tomb. That's interesting to me that it would actually say that. Probably because John wrote it. That there's 153 fish. Right? These are little details that are hallmarks of historicity. So, Chris, I think you're exactly right. In terms of a spiritual meaning, Kevin, I'm not convinced. I read 3 or 4 different ones, and they're really creative, very creative meanings. And if you're into like biblical numerology, you're going to get sucked right into it. If you think that every number has a meaning, you're going to probably find something and you're going to see what you want to see. I don't see it, but that's how it is. Yeah, John. John, do you have an actual meaning for us?
No, that's a great way to sell a book. The meaning of the 153 fish. I know what the 7 thunders of Revelation is.
That's a great point. If anyone wants a bestseller, just title the book 153. It's the answer to all your problems.
The new fish diet.
The new fish diet. That's great, Britt. Hey, let's write it collaborative. Let's all retire here in a few years. This would be great. So he says, come have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Mind you, Jesus is in his post-resurrection body. So it's Jesus. But there's something also different about his body. Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So there's now where we get the reintroduction of Jesus back with the disciples. 15, when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus asks Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, some of you guys are aware of this. It's a famous play on words. Some people think there's no significance to it. I disagree. I've looked at the arguments on both sides about the use of love and how the word love in Greek changes. I think there is a legitimate play here. I think that's what John does. John's very, very purposeful with the language that he uses, and I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. Jesus asks him, Peter, do you love me more than these? The word love there is agape. Do you have this unconditional love? The question is, what are these? What do you think he's talking about? Do you love me more than these? You've got 153 fish, you've got the boats, you've got the disciples, you've got everybody around him. What's Jesus referring to? Some think it could be, do you love me more than this greatest catch that you've ever seen in your life? Do you love me more than the world has to offer? More than what your former life used to be? Do you love me more than your former life? That's what some people say. Some say, Peter, do you love me more than these? Your comrades. The people that you used to say, though all what? Deny you, I never will. Right? Peter's heightened view that he had of himself. Peter always thought he loved Jesus more than he did. Can we do that, by the way? You guys ever been on one of those highs? You thought, that's it, I finally got it, right? And then within an hour, you're off the wave. You're off the mountain. It's just fickle. Faith can be so fickle, right? Or let me change that, not faith. Our affections sometimes can be so fickle towards the Lord.
It doesn't possibly mean, he's not saying, do you love me more than the other disciples love me?
That's what he means. I think he's potentially saying, we don't ultimately know, it's a little cryptic, but I do think he might be saying, Peter, do you still think you love me more than these, more than the rest of your friends here? Do you claim to love me more than them? Do you still see yourself as being supreme over them? And that's the word he uses, right? Agape. And notice what Jesus says, Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that what's that word? Phileo. You know that I love you in a fond, friendship, friendly kind of way. It's not this unconditional love. It's a love of, you know that my love for you is limited, Lord. I know that I used to always say that I loved you in an agape kind of way, and though all deny you, I never will, and I would go to my death for you, and this shall never happen to you. I know that was the person I used to always say I was, but Lord, I realize I love you and I'm just fond of you. There's a limitedness that Peter realizes about himself. And when you realize that your love for God is limited, what do you depend on every day? His love for you. That's exactly right. You depend on Romans 8, 37, 38, and 39, that nothing will separate you from His love. See, if my love for God was dependent on me, lots of stuff could separate me from God, because my love is fickle. It is conditional sometimes. Whereas if my love is limited and I'm aware of that, I fall at the feet of God because my relationship to Him is dependent on His love for me. Look, a great example of this is Jesus' most famous parable. And it's the parable of the lost son, right? The lost son takes his inheritance from his father, and he leaves. And where does he go? What's it called? He goes to the distant country. So this is a long journey. And he leaves his father in shame. And he goes and lives and practices loose living, fill in the blanks, whatever that is. And when he finally runs out of money, and now he's got to work a little bit, and he's now feeding pigs, the lowest of the low for a Jew, he finally reasons to himself. What does he say? I will go back to my father and I will work as a hired servant. Right? He decides to go back and work for his father's relationship again. And on his journey back, his father sees him from a long way off, and his father does the one thing that no Jewish male would do at that time, because it was completely silly and it showed a lack of honor. And what was that? He takes off running. You just didn't run back then. You didn't run around. It made you look like you didn't have your affairs in order. If you're running, it means there's something off. You were very calm wherever you went in that day, because it made you look like everything, all of your affairs were in order. Okay? Very unlike today. So here's this father who runs out to his son. His son begins the words, "Father," right? "Let me be a hired hand," and he stops him. And what does he do? What's he give him? Gives him a robe, a ring, sandals, kills what? The best fattened calf. Get everyone together. Let's have a party. For my son was once lost and now he's found. And everybody is celebrating, because what did this son do to earn his father's favor and love and blessings? What did he do for it? Just returns. He just came back. It's just as the father runs to his son, Peter swims violently to the shore just to be in the presence of Jesus. They're not even talking. We have no sense. It's a quiet breakfast. They're just eating. And after breakfast was over, finally, Jesus speaks up. It's just enjoying the presence of Jesus. And the father restores his son. Only one person didn't like it. Remember him? Who was he? The older brother. The brother who was all about the rules, right? All about what's right. And I've been serving you all these years, and you've never killed a fattened calf for me. Okay? And this is the paradox. This is the paradox of our faith right here. It's incredible. So Peter replies, "Lord, you know that I'm fond of you. I love you." Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." Second time he asked Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" There it is again. What word is that? Agape. He says, "Yes, Lord. You know that I phileo you. You know that I'm fond of you." "Shepherd my sheep," he told him. 17, he asked him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you phileo?" So Jesus starts off twice. Do you agape me? Do you love me in an unconditional way? Do you love me more than these around you? And finally, he meets Peter where he's at, and he says, "Are you fond of me?" It's like he comes right to where he's at and says, "Peter, I'm willing to accept what you have to offer me. Where you're at in your life right now, I'm willing to accept right here. I'm not going to ask more of you than you're capable of giving. Do you phileo me?" And what is it that Peter says? And it says, Peter was grieved that he asked him the third time, "Do you phileo me?" Why do you think he was grieved? What's that? Maybe so. Why do you keep asking me the same question? Could be that.
I think he's thinking back to when he denied him the 3 times. He's like, man, he's thinking Jesus is thinking about that. He didn't really. But then he realizes he knows all things.
He knows all things. That's exactly what he says. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I phileo you." In other words, I think the sadness of Peter was that he realized this is as much as he could love Jesus. Did you ever thought on that, Chris?
That's where I was going to go. I think his grief is more the fact that I think he saw the distance between him and Christ and grieved that. I think the grief, this is my opinion, I think he's grieving because Christ, when Jesus is saying agape, it's almost like, and Peter's saying phileo, Peter's being honest. He's not putting on airs in front of Jesus anymore. He's not, the pride has been stripped away. And he's in this honest place, but I think the grief is because Christ had to come to him. And he's recognizing when Jesus says, do you phileo me?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like he's feeling the weight of what that distance that Christ had to come. Even on the distance that was on the cross, he had to come for us. And now he's still, even past the cross, still having to come to us.
Yeah.
And I think that grief is the grief of humility.
Yeah.
Of humiliation.
I think that's what it is, Chris. I totally agree. Look, if we ask ourselves, if we were to apply this text, and I said, how many of us here grieve not desiring in our hearts to spend more time with the Lord? That we want more of that, right? That how many of us grieve that we just don't love His Word even more than we do, or know His Word even more than we do, or make Him known more than we do? Right? That we love Him, we want more for ourselves, but He meets us where we're at without a finger wagging. And some of you got to get that image out of your head that you grew up with, and He meets you where you're at. Yeah, Dean.
Well, part of this I see that, Peter was the leader of the disciples. And Christ said, upon this rock I will build my church. And then he denied him. And then he's back meeting the Lord again. And so he had a lot more pressure.
Yeah. Well, think about this, Dean, because you're kind of going where I was about to go. I want you to think about this for a moment with Peter. Peter is the one that professes that great statement, right? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Right on the heels of that, after Jesus tells him what's about to happen, and Peter says, this shall never be, what does Jesus say to him? Get behind me, Satan. Peter's the only one that got accused of a satanic motivation to prevent Jesus from going to the cross. Peter carried this burden inside of him. And it's really interesting how, in life, there are events and experiences in life that all of us have. And every event and every experience in life yields certain emotions that are impactful to us. And some of them are very explicit. If I said to you guys, hey, think about a time, John, think about a time, Tom, think about a time, Grady, think about a time that you were a child and you were really happy. You would go back into your memory banks and you could access these explicit memories that you can still access, right? Can't you? You can go back to times in your life that you were very happy, you were very sad, maybe you did something and you felt a lot of guilt or shame about it, and you have an explicit memory. And those explicit memories yield these emotions that flow out of that. But there's another form of memory that we know, and these memories are what are known as implicit memories. And these are memories that are deeply embedded in us that we don't have conscious access and awareness to. And it's those that begin to form and shape the people that we are a lot of times, which is why we have to tell our stories. Because when you tell your stories, you give yourself a chance to access the fullness of the memories and the emotions of all that you've been through. And it allows you now to interpret correctly. Because every time there's an event or an experience in life that we face and we have some emotion flow out of it, we have an interpretation that we take on in that moment. And that interpretation can be paralyzing to some people. I mean, think about Peter. What sort of interpretation do you think Peter, as he looks at his life, looks at the words of Jesus in the past, looks at his denial of Jesus, the emotion that he has, he weeps bitterly. What emotion is he full of? Grief, sadness, shame. The one who said he would never do, the one who said that all would but him, he's the one that does it. He's filled with his own hypocrisy. And what do you think the interpretation could be that Peter has of himself as a result of this? I'm a fraud. I'm not who I thought I was. I'm not who anybody thinks I am, right? And this is what Peter's carrying with himself. Maybe he thought, I'm just going to go back and just be a fisherman and just go do what I've always done and just, I don't even know what to do with my life anymore. And Peter now is confronted by Jesus, and Peter recognizes, Lord, you know all things. Meaning what? You know the depths of my heart. Psalm 51, you know the depths of my heart. Only you can make crooked paths straight, Lord. And that's what the Lord is doing here. He's giving Peter a new interpretation. In other words, your 3 denials, Peter, should not yield an interpretation that you're a fraud. What should it yield? What interpretation? Through Jesus as the framework for understanding, does Jesus want Peter? How does he want Peter to interpret what happened?
Forgiveness, restoration.
The fact that I will always need the Lord's forgiveness. I will never be enough to please him. My goal is simply to do the best I can to trust him. I don't need to live every day trying to please God, as heretical as that sounds, because can you? Can you please him? And yet there's people who spend all of their lives trying to please God by making up for what they did. And you can never please God. There's only one thing God is pleased with, and what is that? It's his Son. And as long as he is in us and we in him, he is pleased with us. Behold my Son, in whom I am well pleased. So his pleasure comes from the presence of Christ in our lives, not from all of the things we try to do to please him. He just wants us to trust him. And in my trusting him, he is pleased with me. Right? Did somebody have a comment over here? Yeah, Dwayne.
Jesus calls him Simon instead of Peter. What interpretation do you place on that? And is Jesus trying to say, you're still your old self, but I'm still going to use you anyway? In the next section, he gives him the charge of how you're going to do more. I'm still working with you.
Yeah.
Even though you're your old self.
I think that's it. Dwayne. I think everything about this is taking Peter back to you're still the same guy, but you're different because I'm going to be the source of your strength. And Peter, you're not better than the rest. That's the problem Peter had. Peter thought that he was better than the rest. And Jesus is trying to get him to have an interpretation of his failure. See, failure, you can interpret failure in one way and say, I'm worthless, I'm no good, I'm a fraud, I can never be used again. Do you think there are people that interpret their failures that way, by the way? And then there are people who see their failures, they grieve deeply, as many should, depending on the failure, and yet they are now able to see God do a work that now begins to create a restoration in their heart. And now they become something they've never been before, that they never would have been had it not been for the failure. Can that happen, by the way? Can you become something you've never been before that required the utter failure of some area of your life? What do you think? 100%. Absolutely. And this is why we have to tell our stories. Because unless we tell our stories, we allow these memories to define these interpretations that we have of ourselves.
Well, can I share something?
Yeah, please, Kevin.
I know that in my failures that I've had, I know that had they not come and that God has not restored me through them, I know that I wouldn't be the man I am today.
Yeah. I know you believe that 100%, Kevin. Just, you see it in your heart. And that is the beauty of ashes. Right? Ashes burn something down that's meant to be burned down in order for something to be rebuilt and restored. And that is how God uses failure. Peter was going the wrong direction. He had no idea what to do with it. And so now all of a sudden he says, hey, tend my sheep. Right? I've got a plan for you. I remember, I can remember 20 years ago I went through a divorce, and I can remember the pain in my life of being in ministry, stepping out, and I can remember somebody that meant a lot to me as an act of encouragement, saying to me in front of some people that, Walt was like this diamond that got shattered, and now we just need to find the biggest piece left. And in that, I can remember feeling that the thought was, you will never be what you could have been, but you still can be something else. It'll just be smaller. And it was an attempt at encouragement. Like, hey, there's still a small piece left for you. You'll never be a big diamond for God. And the reality was, no, I was just a cubic zirconium. And I needed the shattering so I could become a real diamond, so I could really be able to understand the real love of Jesus, right? And that's the process. It's like failure doesn't mean now we've got a little, B team over here for you. We've got, hey, go to Pilot Point. There's your little city. You'll never have the impact of going to some place great. And the reality is, God is the one that decides that. He may want you in Pilot Point. He may want you in Houston. God is the one that determines that, not man. See? So, I know, Houston. I'd rather go to Pilot Point than Houston. Any other thoughts on that? So let's kind of, look at this through the lens of Peter, the eyes of Peter, and recognize that Peter, he sees himself in a way that desperately he needs the eyes of faith to see himself differently. And now Jesus is restoring him and says, Peter, I've got something for you that is going to far exceed anything you ever imagined. When I said that you were going to be fishers of men, now wait. There's always been a debate about where was the launch of Peter's ministry, right? Some say it was in his denials of Jesus. I think it's when he gets this restoration from Jesus and he finally sees that God now, the Lord still has this great plan for his life, and it's born out of his love for Jesus. I think that's where it is. So he says, feed my sheep, verse 18, truly I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go. That word stretch, that word is used almost exclusively, the same word for the stretching out in crucifixion. That Jesus is basically saying, Peter, you're going to follow me, you're going to tend my sheep, but there's something coming, and it's going to be the giving up of your life through crucifixion. It's a prediction that he's giving him. He said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. After saying this, he told him, follow me. So Peter turned around. We're still the same people, by the way. I wish there was like this, wow, I'm a completely different person. Look at Peter. So Peter turned around and saw the disciple Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and asked, Lord, who is the one that's going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? What's Peter concerned about? Well, why do I got to die like that? What about John? How's he going to die? Is he going to die by crucifixion too? What is that about Peter? Think about this. Who's he still concerned about? Himself. You can have a restoration, and you can have a new interpretation and identity in who you are in God, and still battle what for the rest of your life? Your flesh, yourself. See? Right on the heels of the restoration of Jesus, he now says, well, what about John? And what is it that Jesus says? Verse 22, he says, if I want him to remain until I come, Jesus answered, what is that to you? As for you, Peter, follow me. So this rumor spread to the brothers and sisters that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not tell him that he would not die. But if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? So it's a really interesting ending here where you're looking at John. I mean, John is writing this gospel. John is the one disciple that was actually preserved from martyrdom. They tried to martyr him. We do have some old records that do say, anybody know how they tried to kill John? Tried to boil him in oil. He wouldn't die. So they threw him to the island of Patmos. And he probably wrote the book of Revelation right then. And he writes John, he writes Revelation, but he wouldn't die. So he was the last living apostle. And basically what John is saying is, the Lord saw fit that I live my days as an old man, and he's going to die a natural death. 24, this is the disciple who testifies to these things himself, who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if every one of them were written down, I suppose not even the world itself could contain the books that would be written. By the way, anybody wonder why does John write about in the third person about himself? He does that most likely, we don't know because he doesn't tell us, but there was a practice back then that you did not find yourself worthy to say your own name and take away from the glory of another. And so he just left his name off, and he just referred to himself in the third person. He would refer to himself at best as the disciple whom Jesus loved, even giving people the idea that they might think it's somebody else. John's love for Jesus was so great. Look, at the cross, who was at the foot of the cross? John. Jesus' mother, right there. In fact, John loved Jesus so much that Jesus on the cross can look to John and say what to him? Behold your mother. He gives his mother to John to care for. Mother, behold your son. See, that's incredible act of faith and trust and love that Jesus had for John. And John just loved him. He sat right next to him at the Last Supper. So it's a really interesting contrast between John and Peter, and yet God uses them both. There are the Johns of the world, and I love the Johns of the world because they are people that you look at and you just envy their faithfulness and how they walk with God. You ever meet them? They're just gentle, they're kind, they're loving, they're servants, and they just love Jesus, and they're such a great testament to the goodness and the glory of God. And then there's the Peters. Most of us who talk big, want big, deceive ourselves in thinking more of ourselves than we ought sometimes, and yet every day we desperately cling to the Lord's mercy and to His grace. Every day. You know, every day I got to end my day. Lord, thank you for your mercy and your grace today. God, today was a tough day, Lord. My mind was all over the place today, Lord. God, my heart today, Lord, my heart was all over the place today. Help me keep my eyes focused on you, Lord. It's tough, isn't it? And yet, you know, I know in my own life, having gone through a beautiful restoration with the Lord and with my church, and yet I still have the same battles I've always had. Right? And that's Peter. That's Peter. That's the Christian life. And so we need each other. We need each other. We need friends in a boat out being with each other, being willing to love and accept each other and encourage each other. So
I think it's interesting too, the contrast that sometimes we place on John and Peter in this section, because like you just said, John always comes out as this guy that Jesus loved, you know, and Peter, the guy that screwed it all up, but was restored. And I think the reality is, and I love how you just put this, you know, we all know those guys who are the Johns in our life, but I think it's interesting that the Johns are just like the Peters. They're just like the Peters. They're just as in need of Christ to come to them as the Peters are. And I think oftentimes, if we're not careful, the Johns will see themselves as Johns and see the Peters as Peters. You know what I mean? Like the Johns, if you're a John, you got to be careful, because you can see yourself as the one that Jesus loves. And he loves me because my sin may not be as public as everybody else's sin, and I can hide it. And so therefore, I must be loved more. And that's not true at all. It's that John needs Christ to come to him, and Christ does in a completely different way to bring about John's humility, his thorn in the flesh, so that John will stay in a place of constant needing of Christ to come to him just as much as Peter does. And I think we all have to be very careful to never think that I'm a John.
Yeah.
And therefore I can do this, or I can figure this out, because both of those men, needed Christ to meet him. It just looked a little different in each guy's life.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. John is John for a reason. There was a love that he allowed to rule his heart. He didn't allow pride, at least as we know. Not that there wasn't pride in John's heart. We're human beings. Peter, you see it more easily, right? I've always said, if you took every sin in the Bible, you could reduce every sin into one of two categories. There are the sins of self-indulgence, and there are the sins of self-righteousness. The sins of self-indulgence are the ones that are easy to see. The sins of self-righteousness are the ones that get the harshest condemnations from God and from Jesus. And so we all battle in those worlds. A couple days ago, I dropped Stacy off at the airport, and anyway, we were saying goodbye, and I'm at the D terminal, and it's packed, and so I just kind of stopped as close to the right as I could, and she gets out, and I'm giving her a hug, and as she's walking off, this guy goes around me, and he stops, and he gets out of his car, and he looks at me, and he goes, I can't repeat what he said, but he says, "Get the out of the way, you an idiot." And Stacy's already walking off, and she turns back to see, because he's screaming at the top of his lungs. And I turned back to her, and I didn't want her to worry, and I was like, "See ya, And so she goes in, and I get back in my car, and I became Dr. Jekyll. I was so furious. And I'm battling. What do I do? What do I do? And so I'm just kind of, he stops, and he loads a couple people in. Does exactly what I do. And so we're kind of heading out. And this is a moment I'm not proud of. And so he kind of gets stopped behind these cars, and I'm able to go around him. And as I'm going around him, I look at him, and he looks at me, and I move over in front of him, and I stop, and I come to a dead stop, and I'm not moving. And he is about to come unglued. He's going crazy, and he's turning his wheel, and I start moving forward, and then I stop, to my shame, and I stop. And man, he finally turns his car, and he goes up onto the sidewalk. Like, he gets his car on the sidewalk, and now he's in full rage mode. And he's coming around, and he's going to try to cut, and then somebody's walking across, and he hits his brakes, right? And I ended up driving off, and that was it. And in that moment, I just remember thinking, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you, Walter? That this is craziness. Just that my flesh can so easily get the best of me. My anger, my whatever, And I have to tell that story, because that's what disempowers it. I've got to say, this is in me sometimes, and I've got to be aware of this. And it's in some of us in this room. See? And there are times that that's happened, and I'm like, sorry, not this week. See? And so I can only pray, God, thank you for your mercy, because that stayed with me for a while, just that I did that. The guilt that I would do that. That's not the man that I want to be.
Thanks
So-
for sharing that. That compares to your parking spot story.
Yeah,
Driving.
I was a saint on that one. I gave that spot up. Yeah. See, saint and car ministry. Yeah.
In your defense, though, it was in front of your wife.
It was. That was really what drove it.
And when that happens in front of your loved ones,
Yeah.
you know, you're going to lose your mind sometimes. And out of protection mode.
Yeah.
And so,
Well.
And while those moments are in all of us, but because of our walk with the Lord, they're a lot less than they used to be.
Yeah. Yeah. God willing, right? That's right. Hey, Dwayne, why don't you pray for us?